My depression is life becomes on hard mode. And I can tell that I'm depressed when the same things that I can normally like brush off or find, like move on from, like hurt more than normal. And so I don't know, like, a joke my boyfriend makes or like negative feedback from a customer where, like regular me in a regular day is like, great, this is like insight, or that was funny. But when I'm depressed, I have a harder time like brushing that stuff off.
Lexi, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to be connected. I posted a tweet, I think it was maybe even more than a month ago, like the end of last year, asking people who follow me who I should interview, and you were one of the people that was recommended. I checked out what you were working on, and I was like, wow, you've been doing so many cool things, so I had to get you on. So I appreciate you making the time. So before we go into Centered and your time at AngelList and Hired and all these things, I'd love for you just to give people a little bit of a snapshot of your background. Like what have you been working on for the last few years?
Yeah, sure. So I started my career at Betaworks, which was a startup studio in New York that actually built Giphy, built Dots, and started off really just working on early stage stuff. They were a studio, so we were creating things in-house and just building stuff from scratch, and just learned how to build early stage products like from nothing. Then ended up at Hired and then AngelList, really working on this like hiring platform thing. So, saw the pain of hiring engineers firsthand at Betaworks, knew that it was like really painful and felt like it was a fundamental blocker towards innovation in the space, is just finding engineers and making something actually happen and get built. And so really focused on doing that. Hired was the first employee in New York, so the first business employee building out the New York market, which became their second largest market. And just for people who don't know what Hired is, could you just explain what it was at a high level? Yeah. Hired is, as of recently, no longer, it is done, but at the time, it actually started as developer auction, and they came up with this really innovative concept at the time, which was engineers were super in demand. They were getting blown up on LinkedIn. They weren't responding to anybody. And so they put the engineer in control. So companies would basically bid on engineers. They had to put upfront salary, make that totally transparent. And then engineers got their pick between companies, and they had everybody coming to them on their times. So it was very much about putting the candidate first, and it took off right when they started. So engineers loved that concept. It was like totally provocative. And then companies found it as an alternative way to get engineers and actually get them to respond. So Hired, since then raised like $150 million or something like that. Got really big, and then, didn't really work out so well.
Just before we move on to the next part, just curious, because I know someone listening to this is thinking, wow, they raised that amount of money, and that sounds like a crazy amount of money to anyone, and it didn't work out. And for someone like me, I know that happens all the time, right? And the context is that 9 out of 10 startups don't really even make it even to that level. And this is not to talk about them in particular, but just like, what's the context there in terms of what didn't necessarily click? Do you think it was just the idea worked to a certain level, but then it couldn't scale past a certain point?
Yeah, a couple things. So first, the idea worked great in San Francisco. The dynamic was like perfect. There was so much demand for engineering. There were just, it was a really good marketplace for there. And then we hit the gas really hard on expansion. We went into I think 12 countries or something. That might be wrong, but we opened tons of city offices. My job, the second half, I was opening offices in Atlanta and Austin and DC. We were going to go do Europe and Asia. And we just put it on really hard without really knowing the dynamics of those markets and like if it was the same. And I think San Francisco, at least, now it's like remote. So who knows? It's going to be a totally different world. But at the time, the dynamics, the hiring dynamics in San Francisco were just kind of different than other places. And so ended up having to scale that back.
Yeah, and that's complete. And it's a great learning quite early on in the conversation, just because, and I hadn't even planned to really ask you this, but it was just when you brought it up, I thought, I remember being reached out to by someone at Hired, and it was probably like an automated email or whatever. But I remember seeing it and thinking, oh, wow, this is such a great idea, because if you're someone who's got a level of experience at certain companies or whatever, your skill set is quite unique, that you're not necessarily even looking for jobs. You're just getting pinged often, right, by recruiters and companies and stuff like that. And I've heard someone talk about this. There's a guy, Sean Puri, who was on the podcast recently. He was talking about using like the agent model for like, these whether it's engineers or like high level folks at different companies. And to some people that might sound kind of crazy, because it's like, okay, they're just engineers, they're not like rock stars. But in the business world right now, like there's a limited supply of them, I guess is one way of putting it. So I think just flipping that is really interesting. But anyway, so that was Hired, and then you were going to come on to your time at AngelList as well.
AngelList was one of the biggest competitors of Hired at the time. But their job site was totally free. They were going after the same customer, which was this high growth startup who needed a lot of engineers quickly, was understaffed on the recruiting front. So maybe had one recruiter to like many, many roles, whereas, a Google or a Facebook was well staffed on recruiting, and they needed to scale up quickly. So when I joined AngelList, and I had happened to work with some of the engineers who, later became the CEO of Talent, I had worked with them at Betaworks, and they knew I'll get into it more later, but they knew I was really kind of creative and hacky around matching engineers and companies. And so they brought me on to be the first business employee. That job site was totally free. They knew that there was a market opportunity because Hired was growing so quickly, and we wanted to build paid products in the space. We wanted to turn it into its own company. And so I was the first person to help with that. And it was just me and a bunch of engineers. Yeah.
yeah, we'll definitely get onto some of that in a minute. But so that's awesome. So you came from this background of Betaworks, working on a bunch of startups, Hired, where you're working on, that same world of recruiting and talent, but like in a new innovative way, and then similarly on AngelList side as well. So what you're doing today with Centered is quite different. I've seen you describe it as the masterclass of mental health. So we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into that in the second half of this conversation. But the first half was really around, I haven't actually done many conversations on recruiting and talent and getting great talent. And I think you've got incredible experience in that. So we're going to go into a bit of that shortly. But when we had our call a few weeks ago, just to introduce ourselves, I asked you a question which sounds super cringe, but it was actually a useful one to ask, which was, what is your superpower, and like, what are you really good at? And the reason I asked that is because I'm as interested in the founders of companies, which you now are, as much as I'm interested in some of the early employees who are often as talented, if not more talented, than the person who started. And I think we don't always get to hear their stories as much. So I think you're definitely one of those operators out there that has incredible experience. So yeah, I'm curious, like, what do you think of your superpowers?
Recruiting is complicated, and getting the best people in the door is complicated because best is super subjective. And so the thing that I think I've done better than a lot of people, or I think I've kind of approached creatively and differently, is figuring out what best is and kind of throwing out the established norms of what best is. I think Silicon Valley is obsessed with backgrounds, and I think that it has its purpose, right? When you see somebody who's built an amazing company before and you want to invest in them again, that's understandable that they have a real track record. But otherwise, I think that people are really they're scared of people without backgrounds that they understand and believe in. We saw a lot of candidates at AngelList just get ignored or rejected because people were not comfortable with risk around taking on someone based on their abilities and ability to grow. And so what I think I've always been really good at is identifying potential in people, helping them find an edge in the door, helping them find that way to explain themselves and convince people that they can do things, and giving people a chance. And I think that I gave a lot of people chances at different companies and showed, we built processes on the platforms around how to give people the opportunity to get noticed and get attention. And I think that, I think recruiting is a little bit, sort of like investing can be, risk averse. And I think that I've always kind of pushed it in terms of finding non-traditional people and really getting them to kind of contribute and help build a vision, even if it wasn't, the standard team.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I love that answer because I think when I look at all the people I've interviewed who are entrepreneurial, people often asking me like, what's common amongst all those people? And they're completely different people, not just by like race, gender, geolocation, whatever. It's just like the types of personalities are very different, but there's one or two really common things. And I often say life's a pitch in in that like you're always pitching something, whether that is you're pitching your company in this case, or you're pitching to employees to join you, or for investors to invest in you, or even like in a personal life, like you're pitching for someone to be your mate in life and your partner or whatever. So I think just the ability to convince people of a vision that doesn't necessarily exist yet or something in the future is a common, that to me is essentially entrepreneurship, the first part of entrepreneurship anyway.
Totally.
So on the recruiting side, we're going to go into a little bit about how you've thought about recruiting and the lessons learned from different worlds. Let's talk a little bit about AngelList before we move on to that. You told me before that AngelList was really great at experimenting, and I think again, it's a really innovative platform. They've done some really cool things, not just on the talent side, but also creating syndicates. And then recently there's been these rolling funds that are quite interesting. So I think a lot of people listening to this are aware of AngelList, but I'm curious from your time there working with the folks at AngelList, being part of the leadership team in your part of the company, why is it that experimentation really stood out to you as like one of their strong suits?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of people know AngelList from Naval, and that he has strong personalities about how companies should be built, how a lot of things should work in the world, which he's amazing at, right? He's a philosopher. And one of his philosophies at the time that I joined AngelList, and it was the case for a long time, it's less the case now, it was actually basically all engineers working there. And it was all senior engineers who were basically like on deck is the on deck word, but who were in between their own company and would probably go start their own company next. And that happened a lot. They're now founders, CEOs, CTOs of other companies. But the idea was really to let them freely decide what was important, figure out what was important, and build what was important. That was like the culture. And what that meant was there were a lot of people doing a lot of different things and iterating on different things. And the way to kind of keep each other organized was to structure our experiments, right? And so make an argument for why we thought an experiment was important, and then, ship on it, ship fast, and learn. And so that was like one of the things I loved so much about AngelList. And I think they did a good job keeping that in the culture later, which is that you can just get caught up in the momentum of stuff really easily, especially when you're a mid-sized company. You're like moving. It's just like, oh, well, we do this and we are this way, and this is what the company is. But, markets change, things change, your customers change, there are new competitors in the landscape. And I think you have to stay nimble and have to stay willing to throw it out and, not throw out the whole company, but throw out the stuff that was working 3 years ago and say, is this really working, and see where we need to go. And so I felt constantly like when I was at AngelList, we were running new experiments like we were new. And, yeah. So
are there any that you remember distinctly that was something either you thought about or someone else in the team said, this is an experiment we should run? And in the beginning, it might not feel like it makes sense, but through that process, it ends up becoming a product feature, a new product. Is anything coming to mind there?
One experiment was, this was super humbling for me, but it was actually around prices, which is I came from Hired. We had charged 15% per hire. That was low compared to recruiters, but still really high to startups. And so I came in with this lower price. And that was actually one of the first things I did on the job was I was like, I'm going to set the price and we're going to experiment and see what people say about this. And of course, people liked it because we're lower than our competitors. But then like around a year later, we actually ran this experiment to raise the prices significantly. And the reason for that was we needed the margin to deliver better candidates. We also wanted to deliver a higher service level. So we're experimenting with actually doing some of the recruiting for people or like, you know, really working on ways to take the frictions out of their lives. And we, you know, did some research and found that people actually were willing to pay almost 3x to what we priced it out initially.
Could we just actually just paint a picture of what that flow looked like and where the money was actually paid? Because for me, as someone who's used it for jobs or hiring, well, I haven't really used it for hiring, but if someone's a candidate looking for a job, it's free, right? So how was it? Yeah. How did you guys make money?
Yeah. So so free job site. And then the core strategy was that we were going to build paid products that solved really specific problems of the customers that were already using our free recruiting stuff. And the main problem that they had was recruiting high quality senior engineers. And we just heard that over and over and over again. And so we built 3 different paid products at the time. Now some of them like merged or sunset or whatever, but we built these different paid products to charge companies more for senior engineering hires. And so the first one was actually A-List, and that was a competitor to Hired in the space where we placed top engineers at companies and gave them access to an exclusive pool of senior engineers. So, and then we charged a placement fee.
And so just to put that in perspective, you mentioned 15% is what Hired charged. Is that of like a year's salary or... Yeah, so if someone's being paid and engineers are paid quite well, so I'm just saying an average 200K for an engineer or something like that, Hired would be paid 15% and it's probably more than 200K a lot of the time. So so that's 15%. And then how did you guys charge? What was your number?
So we started at $10,000 flat. I thought that, you know, salary, like I had all these philosophies around it that were totally wrong. But $10,000 flat. And then later we went up to 20% of the first year base salary. And then we would also do subscription roll-ins where they got a certain number of hires or unlimited hires, and that kind of like got brought down.
Got it. And that's, again, just to clarify, that's being paid by the company hiring. And for a lot of people listening to this that have never gone through this process, there's a reason all companies give you a crazy bonus for referring people is because the process of hiring good people is really expensive. And it's not just putting an ad out and then like reviewing CVs. It's like the cost of paying the HR person or many people, the interview process for your employees who have to then go and do our interviews. There's just a whole process. So it can cost a lot of money. But in the long run, for a lot of tech companies especially, like hiring the best people is incredibly important. It's their competitive advantage. So thanks for clarifying that. So yeah, you're about to tell me about the experiment with the pricing.
Yeah, so I came in like 24 years old, so high and mighty about like that I thought the prices were too high and that the market needed a disruptive lower price point, and that we could still charge a lot, but we could come in lower and just be a disruptive self-serve competitor. I learned a lot around actually fulfilling the needs of the customer is more important than being cost disruptive. But if you can fulfill the needs of the customer in a cost disruptive way, and like, so I think that's been like my journey ever since, is figuring out like the amount of self-serve versus hands-on, right? Like jumping forward to center, like therapy is very hands-on. Can you build a self-serve product, but that doesn't get looked at like a YouTube video or meditation app? And so, you know, finding that middle ground and like finding the price point has been just this like ongoing experimentation journey for me. But yeah, so we raised the prices 3x. I thought we were going to lose like all of our customers. We really didn't. We only lost like a small amount. And it turned out that people were willing to pay a lot. The alternative was still bad. If they didn't get good candidates from recruiters and they got good candidates from us, that was like what mattered. And so it really just came down to focusing on what our customers really needed, and which was good candidates. And then, going on our end to spend more money to make that experience better.
Got it. And just to give people a sense of scale, you were the first business employee there, and from the time you were there, you went from 0 to $20 million in revenue, I believe, right, for the year?
Yeah, in around 3 years. Yeah.
In around 3 years. Got it. And there were like 50 employees, I read. So this was quite a significant growth period, just going from a tiny team, working with engineers, working on product, taking it to market. So let's go into a little bit about your lessons from hiring, not just as someone who was part of a company hiring people yourself, but helping other companies hire. You mentioned a story earlier at Betaworks where you managed to convince 40 different engineers in 3 months to get jobs, or help place them in places or something along those lines. Could you share a bit more background on that?
Yeah, so I mentioned before, I told them I'm going to do this hiring thing. They were like, no, I did it anyway. And it's like funny that they still kept me on, but and I did a really good job of it. Hired didn't exist then. There was really like nobody playing in that space very well in terms of just doing like creative, original stuff around recruiting. Now there are tons of recruiting startups, so it's like different. But so yeah, basically I just built like massive lists of every engineer in New York, based on different skill sets. And then we were a creator community. And so I built this community around all the products we were building, all the different opportunities, and letting people know actually different opportunities to test products early. That was one of the first things we did. So this community around testing products, which at the time I actually interviewed Ryan Hoover for a job as a GM of one of our products, but he was starting on Product Hunt. And I was like, okay, good luck. Like, you can do your product testing site, and like I'll do my product testing community. So I think he beat me there pretty significantly. But we're doing this community around building, around testing. Engineers were really excited about, hearing about things they could build, being part of stuff, getting opportunities. And at the time, in New York, startups were just not nearly as popular as they are now. And so, so I just started this community, and then like emailed people in all these different ways to like get their attention and like get on their radar. And so we also had just done Giphy, and so I'd like send them GIFs, like just GIFs or like funny jokes, or like I just was like nutty and had no idea like what I was doing. And so I just like experimented and said creative stuff and got all these people excited about Betaworks.
Can we just go into that a little bit deeper? So you mentioned the engineers, you said you just fired off these emails to them. Like, is this just literally cold emails? And like, what were you doing to identify these people? Was it just going on LinkedIn and scraping it, or just manually doing it? I'm curious what that looked like.
Yeah, there used to be a way to scrape GitHub emails, and so I did that.
Like, because scraping essentially, just from my point of view anyway, for people who don't know what that means, you're basically going on a site and scraping basically publicly available emails a lot of the time, or you're using, or not just emails, information, but you're creating a program to do that for you faster than a human would do it on their own. And sometimes you're using 2 different data sets and bringing them together. So you might say Bilal Zaidi's product hunt profile matches up with Bilal Zaidi on this, who is database of his website, and that's a publicly available address. So we think 95% probability this is his email address or something like that. So yeah, I don't think it's necessarily like, I think a lot of smart startups are doing that. It's just, it doesn't always get talked about that openly. So thanks for sharing that.
Sure. Yeah. And I was like a scraper master over the years. I have scraped so many things, had so many like Twitter bots, LinkedIn bots, like all these like ways to just like hack connection I've like done. But yeah, so we scraped a bunch of emails. We found people's emails, which like engineers actually tend to be pretty sensitive about their data and getting scraped. So like, I think like people caught on to that later, but it was like, different. It didn't sound like a recruiting email. It sounded like a creative opportunity to be part of something. And So and you know, also I think that just being part of a new, like being part of stuff that was new was really exciting. And I think that's always exciting to people. Like the number of people I've been able to just get the help from on my own startup because I think it's new and like I'm passionate is way bigger than you would expect. And I think that, yeah, I think that people often underestimate how exciting it is to just help out on something new and offer,
Yeah.
you know, advice or feedback. And so that's like
And
a
I
thing I
think what
think
you're
people don't run
doing,
into.
yeah, and I think this example on the recruiting side, you're not spamming people and saying, hey, sign up for my newsletter or sign up for whatever. You're saying, hey, we have a potential, we're potentially bringing you money, we're potentially bringing you a job, like there's some value up
Right.
front. And I think that's the difference between, you know, the scientific data part, which is the ability to scrape, you know, the right people, and then the creative part, which is more the art side of how do I write an email in a right way to catch someone's attention and that sort of stuff. So I think that's definitely something worth, you know, digging into for some people. So thanks for sharing that background on Betaworks. So that's all to say you're a master at doing this. You've done it in several different contexts. I guess a question to go into now is really around the focus of hiring. So if there's a founder listening or someone who's interested in hiring people, if you were doing like an 80-20 analysis of the 20% of actions that drive 80% of results, which is Pareto's law, like, are there some things that we can point people towards to focus their efforts on?
I see centered in everything I've done with getting people interested and involved, whether that's on different sides of the marketplace, is this like recruiting experiment. I, you know, recruited therapists and coaches for a long time. I sent them a bunch of messages they didn't care about, and then I found one they did, and that was the product that worked for them on that side, and I figured out the value props that they cared about. But I wouldn't have figured that out if I didn't message a bunch of people a bunch of times. And so the main thing is you just have to get over your pride and reach out to people who you think you should be talking to. And you need to do probably 4 to 5 times the amount that you think. And so whenever I talk to someone who's lost their job and they're looking, or, you know, I talk to my sister just graduated, so they have like, you know, new grad friends, I'm always telling them on that side, you know, you have to set some goals around the number of people you're going to message and reach. And, you know, I think it's the same on the company side, which is like, you have to be brave and you have to really think creatively about like the different people who could make a big difference in your company. And then you have to be talking to them. You have to be putting in the effort to reach out. And I think a lot of people, they just find that uncomfortable or they're scared. And so I've taught so many people. That's what we taught companies to do on A-List. That's what we taught people at Hired was you just have to send more messages than you think. And then you have to be really like earnest, right? Earnest and passionate and optimistic, because you're selling something that's objectively worse than what they're getting from bigger companies, which is, you know, maybe less money or less promise or less stability. And so you have to make up for it in like soul.
Yeah, I love the way you said that. So yeah. So, and just to let's go into a couple examples. So I love that you brought up your sister and her new grad friends, especially with what's going on right now. We're in a very uncertain market. So let's try to translate that into like what that process looks like and the actual number, you know, as a minimum. So I'm assuming when you say reach out to people, that means reaching out to people on LinkedIn. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So when you're a new grad, LinkedIn is pretty challenging because nobody really cares about you. Whereas like my LinkedIn, now that I have like titles and stuff, my response rates is like much, much higher. And so I would always tell people, well, first of all, to hit the point of contact you care about in like multiple different ways. And so, and a lot of people are like ashamed or embarrassed about that. So unless they do sales. So if you're trying to get into the door to a company and you apply for a job, you should also add that person on LinkedIn. You should find their email and tell them that you applied for the job. You should just, and then you should follow up every like 4 days until they respond. And in sales, there's this like, you know, gross thing, which is that, you know, you're really supposed to do like 6 to 8 email follow-ups, even though it feels like terrible because a lot of people respond on the 6th one. And so it's again, just getting over your pride and not being afraid to follow up. I'm not saying follow up with every single person 6 times, but use your judgment there. But to just be really like persistent, to hit people as many different ways as you can find. And I actually think for the new grads, that shows like hustle and commitment. Like if somebody was really that dedicated into responding to me, I'm like way more interested in them as a candidate than somebody who didn't try and they just applied. And
I think that's a great point, because it's a lesson not just for new grads, but sales, anything where you're trying to get someone's attention. Even me getting in touch with guests for this show, like there's times where I've had like literally 45 emails back and forth, or 3-4 that they don't respond to after they've said yes, and then I have to find a new way to get back to them. One of the things I've learned that helps is not just, first of all, never ask someone to can I pick your brain, because that like phrase turns a lot of people off, especially people who are busy. But showing them up front, like being very clear, this is what I'm looking for, this is why you should consider it, and obviously keeping a nice enough tone. What I think people might do wrong is they just reply back 4 days ago and just say, hey, bumping this email, or just wanted to see if you saw this, which is, not the craziest thing in the world. One thing that's helped me a lot is giving people an update. So when you're saying, if I'm following up a week later, saying, hey, I know, I'm sure you got lots going on. Since the last time we spoke, for me, I've had these 3 people confirm that they're coming on the podcast. I'd love to add you to that or whatever. And if that's for the job, there might be something new information that requires you to update. And I know that's harder in a job situation because the power dynamic is very strict there. But that's just a great thing to get used to doing. Are there other things like that might be worth sharing for people?
Yeah, I used to do this little like boot camp for all the young people that I knew through my sister, where I would make them look at a company's website and explain back to me what they did, which so many people mess up in job interviews. So many people. And like one of the things I always wanted to reject people for basically was when they like couldn't do their homework in a way that was thoughtful. I think it's just really good etiquette to do your diligence. And I also think it's good learning. So like with the new grads, I'd be like, tell me what this company does. And like, tell me who their competitors are, and tell me why they might be succeeding. Like, what are they actually doing well? And you have to figure that out, on the website. And so many people, they go, oh, it's cool. Or like, oh, like they're doing something new in the space. But to me, it just felt like they didn't try very hard. And I think effort is like, I've always been a person that just like efforted, like just put a lot of like juice and effort in, like,
that stands out when you're getting hundreds of emails about a job. Right. The person who went the extra mile, not just in an annoying way, but you can tell they were very thoughtful. That's what stands out in that situation.
Totally.
So why don't we switch gears a little bit to Centered, because I think what you're working on right now is super interesting. And could you just give a high level of what Centered is?
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned the tagline that I was using on my LinkedIn, which is the Masterclass for your mental health. What that actually means is we are working with therapists and coaches all over the world and creating high quality instructional technique videos for therapeutic techniques that you can use for like coping and dealing with the difficult emotions and situations. So therapists already teach these exercises or techniques in one-on-one sessions with clients, and but it takes time, and not everybody has access to those exercises. And so we want to take those exercises and make them accessible to more people so that they have self-serve therapy whenever they need at a lower price point than going and meeting with a one-on-one practitioner.
And this started because you had your own personal experience where you had a down moment. I don't know how much you want to share about that, but just when we spoke, you told me that you were working, it looked like everything was great on the outside, but on the inside you were having issues. And people who've listened to this podcast know that was something I had myself as well. It's kind of what birthed the start of the podcast. So whatever you're happy to share, I'm curious, like, how did that create a foundation for what you ended up making now?
Yeah, I was at a really low point. And again, like you said, nobody knew at work. I could be really upset and then hop on a call and you couldn't tell, right? So I think a lot of this stuff is below the surface. A lot of it you can't identify in people, but it's happening. And, the numbers are staggering. It's a huge amount of our country is dealing with anxiety and depression and worse, right? So yeah, so I was really struggling and I didn't know, I was very afraid of my own struggle. So I didn't, I was just, I didn't know how to get through because I was so frightened by what was happening in my head. And so my mom is a health coach. She's gone through her own struggles as well. And she basically said to me, we need to build you a toolkit of things you can do to be okay in the moment. And I was like, what's a toolkit? What is a tool? I don't know what that is. And I learned, and we did a lot of research and learned that, first of all, there was really one of the main gold standards of therapeutic exercises or tools is this DBT therapy, which is, it was designed initially for people who are suicidal. It's used much more broadly now. And a lot of people might have heard of CBT, which is usually used for anxiety. So it's thought restructuring or taking a negative thought and getting a different perspective on it. It's coping, letting stress pass through you and knowing that you're going to be okay. And so DBT was designed for even more intense situations. And it's often taught in this like almost classroom setting. So we basically found a DBT group. I joined and did it for a year. And every week I went in and there was a small group with a therapist and we got taught these skills. And so the therapist would teach the skill, we'd get homework and we had to go home and practice it through the week and learned everything from like, getting in, like when you're feeling overwhelmed, to like get in the shower and switch it between hot and cold to, exercises to really question if you're having like a really negative thought. So ran the gamut of types of exercises and techniques, and I really got a foundation for things I could do to be okay. And so, yeah.
And so you talked about DBT, CBT. So I don't know what all the acronyms stand for. I think CBT is like cognitive behavior therapy. DBT, I've forgotten what it stands for.
It's dialectical behavioral therapy. Yeah.
Okay, great. And those are essentially like it seems like the two most popular from what I could see in this world. And they're slightly different focuses. I think if people are listening to this, you might have heard the conversation I had with Emily, we also talked about mental health a few episodes ago, and I think hers is more based on CBT. You described going through this process, and when we had our discussion earlier, you told me that you felt like it was just only for the 1% or so, like people who could afford to do this. And to share like tangible numbers, this costs like I think $100 per week or something like that for you to attend, and it wasn't covered by insurance. Out of pocket, not insurance, and I think it's up to like $200, $250 now. And that for a lot of people is just not something they can afford to do, obviously. So, so I guess what I love about what you're doing now is you're saying, okay, we need to create something that's more affordable, more accessible to a greater number of people. And the way you're going to do that is through these bite-sized pieces of content where you're taking therapists and taking those actionable tools and allowing people to kind of digest it. Is that an accurate description?
Totally. So in my own experience, after DBT, after all of this, I got interested in learning more techniques for more areas of my life that were difficult. And I found a lot of like worksheets or workbooks where there were exercises, but I tried it, like, have a ton on my desk, and it's basically like reading a textbook without a teacher. And so you just, when you're not feeling well, you don't have a ton of motivation. And so we wanted to take that teacher element of DBT and bring it to these exercises and combine them to create a really high quality internet experience, user-friendly experience for learning techniques. And ideally you learn these when you're not struggling, but we are trying to make it so that if you are struggling and you just need immediate support, this is user-friendly and intuitive enough that you can actually get relief.
Love that. So, could we give a few examples of like the most common things you are working on? I'm sure you mentioned anxiety there. I'm sure there's like a few buckets that you're mostly focused on, right?
Yep. So anxiety, work stress, depression, burnout, and then like focus and motivation is a huge one. People really want help with that, and so those are the main areas that we focus on. But then there are other niches that like are pretty underserved in the market. So like grief. Or even being an ally, so supporting someone else's mental health. We talk to a lot of people whose mother or friend or cousin is struggling intensely, and learning how to help that person is like a big use case as well. And so, yeah, those are our main categories. The therapists actually have tons of stuff, and what's interesting is like a lot of the same techniques that are used for trauma are relevant for depression or anxiety, and so there's kind of some overlap between them. But the point is that there are thousands and thousands of techniques out there. It's just hard to get access to them, so we're tagging and labeling them based on those specific emotions, but it's really about giving people the full extent of the techniques available in the world.
Yeah. So, I don't know if any stand out to you. If we went through a few of those, are there any tools we could share with people listening? Because all of those, like either myself or someone I care about deeply has gone through all of those. And I think most of them, like anxiety, we all experience. Focus, motivation, I think a lot of people listening to this have definitely had issues with that. Grief, we all go through for sure. I think depression is a little bit different because not everyone necessarily goes through like deep depression, but a lot of people do. So I know you mentioned the shower example there before. I love that example because it's essentially, I've heard other people describe it as like changing your state, your physical state. So whether that is like going for a run, going for a walk, playing some music. A guy on my show, Ryan Beagleman, who started Summit Series, told me he turns the light off and puts music on in the shower and dances, which is hilarious. But also you could see when you study it, like, yeah, that's definitely changing your state. It's both like the shower is cold, there's music on, and it's dark. So are there a few others that really stand out to you that you even use or people do? So why don't we start off with maybe focus, motivation, because I think that's something I've struggled with myself.
We have the psychologist, she taught a tool, it's not live yet, but it's called planned obsolescence. And the idea is that you should proactively plan for times that you're not going to be productive and schedule it. And so it sucks because like I think we all want like a magic pill that just makes us more focused or productive, but of course, and she's a motivation and focus expert actually. So she was like, schedule your times when you're not going to be productive, and then really like actually just don't be productive so that you can come back. Because I think a lot of us do this like middle ground bullshit where we, surf the internet and like don't actively rest. And for me, I deal with intense depression sometimes, and the answer is always very, very proactive rest. But I think we're not usually good at resting because we have all these like inputs and like blend our lives and stuff.
Yeah.
So
I think especially now because we're all pretty much working from home, it's very difficult to turn things off. And I definitely have this where like half of my job essentially is to be on social media, speaking to people, promoting my podcast. I also work on social stuff for ads and startups. So it's just like constantly you're in that. And I don't like hate it as much as other people do, but I'm sure I need a break from it too. So I try my best to like have a real break from it where I can. And like, even if it's literally just putting the phone in the other room, which sounds crazy, like it's an addiction, but it kind of is, so that's an interesting one. And then in terms of, so that was, I guess, more for focused, what I heard there. Is there anything for like motivation where people are at a crossroads and they're really just demotivated, let's say? Is there anything that stands out, an exercise for that?
Yeah, so a lot of what these coaches and therapists say around that is that it usually comes down to values exercises or uncovering why you're unmotivated. And so we had a good example of one. Yeah, okay, it's like this values exercise that we taught. And we basically try to give you these hacks to understand your own values and the things that you care about to find the lack of alignment. But because it's hard, you don't always see it. I work in the space and I can't see it always in myself. And so this values exercise we did was it was based on people you admire. And so you actually like wrote down the people you admire and then what their role is and then the things you admire about them. So you'll be like Oprah and that she's authentic, or like, the Dalai Lama and like, helping people. And you like write down these values of what you respect in other people. And then you go back and you look at these values and you see how you're doing on those values, and if those are things that you have in your regular life. And the truth is you're usually not, right? And for me, whenever I get too focused on like trying to make my business like, venture scale or, make money and like all of those things, and I love that stuff, but whenever I really am too focused on that, I'm not as happy, because you have to do the things that make you feel like yourself. And so oftentimes when motivation is low, is you feel like you're doing something that you don't believe in, or it's against what you really align with and care about being as a person.
Yeah, that's a great one, I think, because for me, I have that all the time where, again, just to use the podcast as an example, since people are listening to it, I've been doing it for like 4 or 5 years, and there's been different times where I've been super motivated, like when I started, and then I got a new job and the job took over, so I took a break, then I came back, and now people will know I'm as motivated as I've ever been doing this. Yeah, but that took a lot of time. Again, with the values, I think one way I look at it is it's focusing on the process, not just the end result. So the end result is, in your case, I need to get investment, I need to grow to this user number, I need to make X amount of money. For me, it's I need to have 1 million people to listen, I need XYZ guest. And now instead I've just focused on, okay, I know what's working. I know that if I do this every week, I create great stuff. I try to get the best people, and I focus on enjoying this conversation. I will keep doing this forever, as long as I feel like it makes sense. And therefore, I'm already winning by having this conversation. And even if no one heard this, I've already gained from it, So I think that's how I've tried to stay motivated. But the truth is, there's a lot of people who don't have that luxury, right? Like, I'm able to do that because I've got more of a flexible work situation. I also have a business where I get income from that. So everyone needs to find that. But that took me some time getting to that place where I was able to optimize for that. So I really like that example. What about for anxiety? Or was that just the shower example? Would that fit, or are there other things that work for you?
I have some other ones to share that I think are like more
Let's
original.
Do it.
So we have this one that I love and I use all the time. And it's called Shut the Door. And this one was designed by a therapist. It's loosely based on some CBT stuff, but she took her own twist on it. And the idea is, it's actually more for when you're overwhelmed than when you're anxious, but they're often very similar. So the idea is that you close your eyes and you imagine this door, and you put everything that's overwhelming you behind the door. And then you shut that door. And then there's a new door, and you open it, and everybody you love and care about is behind that door. And this one, it takes a little bit to learn, but if you can remember it and hold on to it, I can do it in like 5 seconds, and it is awesome. Because I think like the mind is flexible, right? We convince ourselves that these things are real and that they're going to like kill us or like, break us or whatever it is. But it's just great to restructure and give. This one, I think, is a really nice visual restructure.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that one. Was there anything on the depression side? Because I know you talked, again, the shower. Actually, to clarify, the shower example you gave before, what is that generally used for?
Yeah, that's actually kind of a depression one. For me, depression, and that one we don't have on center. That's a DBT one, but we'll probably have it eventually. But for me, when I'm depressed, it's just a very overwhelming feeling. And so I'm like, feeling really like lost or like just sad or bad, and it just feels like it won't end. And so everything I've learned around depression is, well, DBT says the goal is to decrease the severity of the bad feeling and really to not let it get worse. And so my goals when I'm depressed are just to not do anything that makes it worse, and to simply do things that kind of like what you're saying, like change the mental state, or like get air, or, all of these things, but with the goal of not letting it get lower rather than trying to make it.
Got you. Yeah, that makes sense. So you mentioned the shower example, but are there other exercises for someone who's in that zone? Like you mentioned, you have some of those moments where it just takes over. Are there tools that you've now used where it kind of helps you to get out of that situation?
We have a bunch of different exercises. They're called inner child exercises. And the idea with an inner child is, and everybody teaches it so differently, so it's pretty different. But the idea behind the inner child exercise is you imagine yourself as a child or at a point where you are hurting. And you, in the exercise I just did, we talked about the things you love about that version of you at that time that version of you probably couldn't see. And then you basically say what you wish you could tell that inner child. Or tell that child that it's going to be okay, that it's going to get better, that there's all this other stuff that you like love and care, and all these great things are going to happen to that child. And then my mom, who's a coach, gave me this like twist the other day, which is like, actually, because I did this when I was in a depressed state the other day, and my mom was like, what would that child, I picked myself at like 23 or so, but what would that person tell me now? And what that younger version of myself would tell me now is like, look how far you got, look how much you've progressed. You were so brave. You met the love of your life. You started a company. You look at all this progress you made. And right now you can't see it, right? You can't see any of that, but that other version of you would notice that about yourself if they saw you now. And so I think these are super powerful. I think there's something about, reminding yourself that you love yourself is really hard when you don't. And so using an exercise or an image or, a little bit of distance from having to just love yourself and take care of yourself is really effective for me for depression. So, yeah.
To be really transparent with you, when you just said that, my eye swelled up a little bit. So no, because when you said that, I was like, oh wow, that's amazing. I'll just be completely honest. Why I felt like that was because I kind of flashed back to when I had a really down time, and I was like, oh wow, I wish I could have told myself at that moment how I would even feel today, or how I would feel back in the day. So thanks for sharing that, because I know that I think that will help a lot of people. So one last thing I wanted to mention is journaling. I'm curious if you journal yourself, and what format does that look like if you do it, and how does it kind of play into all of this?
Yeah, I've been journaling. Journaling is like a relatively new habit for me. I've been doing it for the past 2 months or so, but I do it every morning. And I wake up kind of sad in the morning. And so a lot of it is reminders of why it's all going to be okay, and like all the things I like love in the world. And so for me, it's kind of this like written pep talk. We've been developing really cool journaling prompts, because I think that sometimes, if you're not sad, like depressed, or you're not going through something, you might be like, what should I use? Like, what should I use my journal for? And that's where we just try to help you go deep in different ways, right? Like that values thing that I told you, that's a great journaling exercise. But for me, yeah, right now it's just the pep talk, and like I also have some sentences that I sometimes write down a bunch that I guess they're like mantras. I think mantras a little woo-woo, but I have 2 that I like write down to myself a lot. One is like something along the lines of like, keep dreaming even when you can't see it. So I can't always see like where everything is going to go, you know, with my company or with my life. And like that sometimes makes me feel like discouraged, but, you know, keep dreaming even like when you can't see it. And then the other one is actually a tool my mom developed for Centered, which is just like, I'm doing the best that I can. And that one is really powerful for me when, you know, it can be really hard on myself. Tech entrepreneurs, like we're all super hard on ourselves. We see all these external, you know, people raising money in 3 months after they built their product and, you know, raising huge rounds and IPOing and like all of these big external milestones. And like, it's just really easy to compare yourself to that stuff and say like, what the fuck am I doing that I haven't gotten there? Like, why is this so hard for me? Or like all this shit. And, that I'm doing the best that I can. She also designed it where you put your hand on your heart and you just close your eyes and you say, I'm doing the best that I can. And it's just a good reminder that like,
focus on you, not all the other stuff.
Yeah. It doesn't help. It's just self-abuse to do that. So, yeah.
Actually, can I ask you, from your vantage point, studying this space, looking at different types of therapy, like what is depression to you? And like, because I've heard different definitions of it, and I guess that's why I'm always I tread very lightly around it, because I know people who've really struggled with it to, you know, 10 out of 10 level. And I've almost kind of diminished my own feelings in that way. And I've never even fully said like, oh, I think I was depressed or I wasn't. I don't know. But I'm curious from your point of view, like what is that?
Yeah, and I am not a therapist, so this is not an official definition.
For sure,
so for me, I'll describe my depression. So my depression is life becomes on hard mode. And I can tell that I'm depressed when the same things that I can normally like brush off or find, you know, like move on from, like hurt more than normal. And so I don't know, like, you know, a joke my boyfriend makes or like negative feedback from a customer where, you know, like regular me in a regular day is like, great, this is like insight or that was funny. But when I'm depressed, I have a harder time like brushing that stuff off. So that's kind of like, I have a hypersensitive thing, which not everybody has, but that's a big part of depression for me. And then the other thing is just, I feel, the hard mode thing is like, I feel like it's really hard so as an entrepreneur, I signed up for a very hard job, right? I have to handle like tons of like information and like piece it together. I have to, you know, of course, like the executing part is hard, but that's actually not the part I'm talking about. I'm talking about the part that's like, you know, balancing all these like trade-offs that suck or, you know, deciding on product decisions that like could kill the business if I like do it wrong, or kill a bunch of time. And those things like regular me can handle, but depressed me finds this stuff overwhelmingly hard. And so for me, it's just overwhelmed by how hard everything feels. And it's the same, you know, it's the same stuff that regular me can like conquer during the day. It's just hard mode. Yeah.
I like the way you described that. Yeah, hard mode. Sure. Because I think for the reason I've struggled with the definition is because it's not a black and white thing. It's a sliding scale. And for me, I've always just thought like, well, maybe I'm just a bit down or maybe I'm upset, which is a normal emotion that we all go through. And maybe that just means I need to fight through that or whatever, you know. And I think especially as a guy, I can just speak for myself, as a guy, it's like you're not really used to expressing all of those feelings a lot of the time. You're kind of just you're like, oh well, suck it up, like be a man or whatever, you know, that phrase that we've all kind of grown up with. And to a certain extent, I think we've also gone to the other side where like sometimes you do need to like be strong in a way, but I think being able to at least like identify it and talk about it and feel okay to not be okay is really important. I think I've only got that as I've got older. But yeah, I really love the few examples you gave there. Just the last thing to close us out is the kind of the future of this space. I think there's a lot of people working on mental health as a whole, which I think is great. You've got different approaches. We talked about CBT versus DBT, therapy versus like coaching, and I think all of those things are important. I'm curious, how do you see this space evolving, and how do you want Centered to be a part of that?
Totally. So the idea of, there are a lot of people in the space trying to make it easier to connect with a therapist. And that is noble because it's hard to find the right therapist. It's hard to find someone who takes your insurance. But I think that once a week product, if you will, of talking to someone for 15 minutes or an hour, and that being the extent of your support, is completely outdated and is not the right model for mental health long term. I think we need immediacy. I think you need to reach people when they're struggling, and therapists just can't. You can't reach someone exactly at the moment that
it's hard to scale that one person any day of the week.
It doesn't adequately serve the needs of people who are struggling, because people who are struggling are in it a lot more than that 1 hour. And so I think that mental health has to get creative around reaching people at, being on demand, being accessible, being on your phone, being easy to pull up when you're struggling, and decreasing the frictions around getting support and help. So, yeah.
So, and so do you feel like in, let's say 10 years from now, what would you like to see in the space? Do you feel like because I don't know the numbers of how many people even get therapy. I'm sure it's like less than 5%. I'm just making that number up, but or even having access to this sort of stuff. Like, do you envision yours being like an app that you're able just to say, oh, I'm feeling anxious, like give me a tool that I can use now? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think that we want to triage your emotional situations. So there are a lot of healthcare startups who are taking on this triaging model in interesting ways. Triaging just means that you get in front of the problem earlier and try to give self-serve solutions before you connect somebody with a one-on-one practitioner. We see that all the time in like FAQs or, help support software is triaging. And so we want to be that like triaging layer for your mental health.
Okay, that's awesome. So Lexi, look, we're going to wrap up shortly, but is there anything else you'd like to share with people? Where can we send people? Obviously, Centered is the one place, but anything else?
So if you want, everything right now on Centered is totally free. We're going to be converting it to paid later, but if you want that weekly text and a weekly email, we just tell you what new tools we have. It's super, super simple. And so you can get that at usecentered.com. So USE and then centered.com. And yeah, I really recommend, you just get that little reminder once in a while. You don't know when you're going to need a tool next, and this just gives you really good tools in your back pocket. So
brilliant.
I would love feedback. People don't hesitate to reach out. I just want to talk to our users and understand how they're feeling and understand what we can build to help.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing so much personal stuff and from all your experience. This has been awesome. So thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.